The dog would not stop scratching at the same corner of the barn wall. Not digging, not playing, just scratching. Low and steady, right where the old boards met the ground, as if something on the other side of that wood was speaking a language only he could hear. Agnes stood in the doorway with a lantern in one hand and a brass folding ruler in the other. The same ruler her husband had carried in his coat pocket for 11 years before he stopped needing coats at all. Inside that barn was something none of her neighbors had seen. Something curved and metal and completely wrong for a cattle ranch in this part of the country. Something she had paid almost nothing for, and something Warren, her own hired hand, had refused to help carry off the wagon. By December, people would drive past her fence line just to look at the barn and ask each other the same question. Not whether Agnes Halverson had lost her mind, whether she had found something the rest of them never had. The storm that was coming had a number attached to it already. Old men on the porch of the feed store were calling it the worst in 34 years, and they were rarely wrong about weather, and never wrong about hardship. Agnes had 3 winters behind her that told her exactly what this one would try to take. She did not intend to let it. The ledger sat open on the kitchen table, and the numbers in it had not changed since morning, no matter how many times Agnes added them again. 42 head of cattle. 11 cords of split wood, less than she wanted, more than she could afford to burn carelessly. 6 months of grain if the mill prices held. 4 if they did not. She wrote these figures the way her husband once taught her, in straight columns, in a hand that did not shake even when the rest of her wanted to. Outside, the wind was already testing the shutters, though the real cold had not arrived yet. It was only October, and October in this part of the country was supposed to be gentle, a season for finishing chores and mending fences before the sky turned serious. But the old men at the feed store had stopped saying October was gentle. They were saying other things now. Things about the geese leaving 3 weeks early. Things about a ring around the moon that had not been there in 30 years. Things about a winter that was going to ask more of people than most of them had left to give. Agnes had heard 2 of them murmur the number themselves, standing by the stove with their coffee. 34 years. That was how long since a storm had done what they believed this one intended to do. She did not go to the feed store to hear predictions. She went to buy nails, and came home with a warning instead, carried in the tone of men who had buried livestock before, and did not enjoy remembering it. Elias was asleep upstairs, his breathing thinner than she liked. A small, persistent rattle that the doctor in town called nothing serious, and Agnes called something she watched every single night, regardless. He was 13, old enough to work a rope, and young enough that a hard winter could still undo him if she was not careful. She looked at the barn through the window, dark and quiet, and mostly empty, since they had sold 2 horses in the spring just to keep the mortgage current. It was a good structure, sound walls, a decent roof, more space than her herd currently needed. But space was not warmth, and a sound roof was not the same thing as a warm one. And Agnes had learned that difference the hard way, twice already, in the 2 winters since her husband had died. She closed the ledger, picked up the lantern, and walked out to stand in the empty barn for a long while, saying nothing to anyone, looking at the walls the way a person looks at a problem they intend to solve before it becomes a tragedy instead. The first winter without her husband, Agnes had done everything the way he always had, believing that following his methods exactly would be enough to keep the ranch standing the way he had left it. It was not enough, not because the methods were wrong, but because half of what her husband did each winter had never been written down anywhere, existing only in his hands and his habits, things he adjusted without ever explaining why. She lost 6 calves that year to cold she still did not fully understand, huddled in a barn that had always seemed warm enough when he was alive to manage it. The second winter, she tried harder. She stacked more hay along the north wall, hung heavier canvas over the largest gaps, kept a fire going longer than the wood budget really allowed. She lost fewer calves, 4 instead of 6, and told herself that was progress, though it did not feel like progress standing over a 4th small body in the frozen mud of February. What she learned, slowly and without anyone teaching her, was that a barn built for a mild climate assumes something about the wind that was no longer true. It assumes the wind will behave. It assumes cold air moves the way it moved when the structure was designed, sliding past instead of settling in. Nebraska winters, and the ones bleeding in from Wyoming when the fronts came from the northwest, did not behave. The wind found every seam the barn's original builder had never worried about, because he had never needed to. Warren, her hired hand, had worked this land longer than Agnes had been alive, and he told her plainly after that second winter that some structures simply were not meant for what nature had started sending them. He said it kindly, the way an old man tells a young widow something he wishes were not true. Agnes did not argue with him. She agreed, actually, more than he realized. The barn was not meant for this. But she had also decided something Warren had not yet heard her say out loud. If the barn was not built for what was coming, then something would have to change inside it. Not the walls facing the prairie. Something else. Something underneath the obvious structure. A second answer hidden inside the first one, though she did not yet have a name for what that second answer might look like. She only knew she was done losing calves to a problem she had already watched happen twice. The advertisement was 4 lines long, tucked into the back pages of a regional paper Agnes only read for auction notices. Military surplus, corrugated steel panels, curved, sold as a lot. Buyer removes. She drove 2 hours to see them, telling Warren only that she needed to check on a delivery of fencing wire, which was not exactly a lie, since she did intend to buy wire on the same trip. The yard belonged to a man named Foster, who had been buying and reselling Army surplus since the war ended, and who seemed mildly surprised that a woman had come alone to look at what he called, without much ceremony, hut panels. Half a Quonset, he told her. Somebody ordered a full one, and only needed half. Been sitting here 2 years. Steel does not care how long it waits. Agnes walked the length of the curved panels laid flat in the mud, running her hand along the ribbed metal, feeling how thick it actually was compared to what she had expected. It was heavier than barn siding, denser, built originally to survive weather in places far harsher than a Nebraska ranch. Foster wanted almost nothing for the lot, mostly because nobody local had any use for half a military shelter shaped like a barrel cut lengthwise. She bought all of it, every panel, every curved rib, loaded onto a borrowed flatbed that groaned under weight. It was never quite designed to carry. Warren met the wagon at the gate that evening and stood there a long moment before saying anything at all. "What in the world is that?" he finally asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer would not satisfy him. Agnes told him the truth. Roofing. Something like roofing, anyway. Something that might solve a problem the two of them had been losing to for 3 winters running. Warren looked at the curved steel, then at the barn behind them, then back at the steel, clearly trying to imagine how one was meant to fit inside the other, or why anyone would want it to. He did not laugh at her, which she appreciated, because plenty of other men in the county would have. He simply said he did not understand what she intended to build, and Agnes told him, honestly, that she was not entirely certain herself yet. She only knew the shape of the problem, and she had just bought the shape of an answer. Word travels faster across open country than most people expect, especially word about a widow hauling Army surplus steel home on a borrowed flatbed. By the following week, Ezra Caldwell rode over under the excuse of discussing a fence line the two properties shared, though both of them understood the real purpose of his visit before he had even dismounted. Ezra ran the most successful cattle operation within 20 miles, and he had not gotten there by taking foolish risks. He was not a cruel man, and Agnes never thought of him that way. But he was a careful one, and careful men sometimes mistake caution for wisdom in situations where they have not actually done the arithmetic. He stood at her fence line, studying the curved panels stacked near the barn, and asked, plainly enough, what exactly she planned to do with a pile of surplus steel shaped like something out of an army camp. Agnes told him she intended to build additional shelter for the herd, inside the existing barn rather than outside it. Ezra's eyebrows rose slightly at that detail, the inside part, and he asked why anyone would build a structure inside a structure instead of simply reinforcing what already stood. It was a fair question. Agnes did not have a fully finished answer yet, only the beginning of one, and she said so honestly, which seemed to trouble Ezra more than a confident wrong answer might have. He mentioned, almost gently, that his own operation had weathered 3 previous hard winters using nothing but well-maintained traditional barns, good hay management, and careful herd rotation. He was not wrong about any of that. His methods worked, for his barn, on his land, with his particular exposure to the wind. Before leaving, Ezra made an offer disguised as a joke, the kind ranchers use when they want to place a bet without admitting they are placing one. He said if her cattle came through this winter better than his, he would personally deliver a sack of good coffee to her door and never mention the steel huts again. Agnes shook his hand on it, mostly to end the conversation politely, though something in his tone made clear he considered the bet essentially already won. She watched him ride off and turned back toward the barn, toward the curved steel waiting in the mud, and toward a plan that existed so far only in her own head and in the careful measurements she had already begun taking with her husband's brass ruler. Warren finally asked the question directly on a cold Tuesday morning, standing in the barn doorway with his coffee going lukewarm in his hand. Why build the steel shelter inside the barn at all? Why not simply set it up somewhere in the yard, where there would be more room to work and less awkward cutting to make curved panels fit inside a rectangular structure never designed for them? Agnes had been waiting for someone to ask that, because the answer was the entire reason she had driven 2 hours for salvage steel, instead of simply buying more canvas and hay like everyone expected. A shelter standing alone in the yard, she explained, would face the wind directly. Every gust off the open prairie would hit that curved steel with nothing to slow it down first, the same way it hit every barn and shed and fence post across the county. Steel was strong, but strength against wind was not the same thing as warmth against cold. A metal structure sitting in open wind would grow bitterly cold on the inside, colder in some ways than canvas, because steel carries temperature so efficiently in both directions. But a shelter built inside the existing barn walls would face something different entirely. It would face air that had already been slowed down once, air that had already lost some of its worst violence passing through the outer walls, through the same seams and gaps that had failed her cattle for 3 winters running. Agnes was not trying to build one wall against the cold. She was trying to build 2, with a pocket of trapped, slower-moving air between them, air that would not carry heat away from the herd nearly as quickly as open wind would. Warren considered this in silence for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly. He asked whether trapped air between 2 walls could really make that much difference, since air itself did not seem like much of anything to a man who had spent his life fighting wind, not air. Agnes admitted she was not entirely certain how much difference it would make. She only knew what she had watched happen during the worst nights of the previous 2 winters, when the barn's outer wall had been bitterly cold to the touch, but the hay stacked several feet inside it had stayed noticeably less cold, simply because it sat further from the source of the problem. If hay could do that by accident, she reasoned, steel and careful placement might do it on purpose, and do it better. Warren was not convinced, not fully, but he set down his coffee and picked up a crowbar anyway, which Agnes had learned over 3 years was the closest thing to agreement she was likely to get from him before the work itself proved her right or wrong. The construction took 11 days, most of them shorter than Agnes wanted because Elias could only manage a few hours before his cough worsened enough that she sent him back to the house against his own protests. She measured everything twice before cutting anything once, using her husband's brass ruler for every critical span, the same folding ruler he had used to measure fence posts and wagon axles for 11 years before his heart failed him one ordinary afternoon in the barn's own doorway. She had never used it for anything this significant before, and something about running its worn brass edge along curved military steel felt like asking him a question she already suspected he would have approved of. The curved panels went up against the barn's north and west interior walls, the two directions that took the worst of the prevailing winter wind. Agnes left a deliberate gap of roughly 18 inches between the new steel skin and the original barn wall, creating exactly the trapped air pocket she had described to Warren days earlier. Elias, on the days his lungs allowed it, helped hold panels steady while his mother drilled and bolted them into the barn's existing frame. He asked her once, quietly, whether this was going to work, and Agnes told him the truth, which was that she believed it would help, though she could not promise it would solve everything, because no single answer ever solved everything a hard winter could threaten. Warren worked the heavier lifting, muttering occasionally about the strangeness of building a barn inside a barn, though his objections grew quieter as the structure took shape and clearly began resembling something more deliberate than the mad idea he had first assumed it to be. By the 11th day, the curved steel formed a shortened tunnel along 2 interior walls, open at both ends to allow the cattle to move freely in and out, with the trapped air gap running the full length behind it like a hidden second hallway. Nobody but Agnes, Elias, and Warren knew existed. She stood back that evening studying the finished shape, running her palm along one curved seam, feeling steel that was already noticeably less cold to the touch than the exposed portions of the original barn wall just a few feet away, even though no fire had been lit yet, and no storm had arrived to test any of it properly. It was not warm. It was only less cold. But less cold, Agnes had learned over 3 hard winters, was sometimes the entire difference between a calf that survived until morning and one that did not. The first genuinely cold night arrived 9 days after the steel was finished, dropping well below freezing with a north wind that rattled every loose board on the property. Agnes woke twice that night to check the barn, lantern in hand, expecting to find the cattle settled comfortably along the new steel-lined walls. Instead, she found Scout, the ranch dog, sitting rigidly near the eastern corner of the structure, scratching intermittently at a specific point where the steel met the original barn wall near the roofline. Exactly the same corner he had fixated on weeks earlier when Agnes first brought the panels home. She knelt beside him and held her bare hand near the seam, feeling immediately what the dog had apparently sensed long before she had bothered checking. A thin, steady draft of outside air was slipping through a gap where the curved steel met the barn's original eave, a place Agnes had measured carefully for the wall sections, but had not adequately sealed where the roofline and the new panels intersected. It was a small gap, barely wide enough to slide 2 fingers through, but the wind outside was strong enough that even a narrow opening was pulling genuinely cold air directly into the trapped pocket she had built specifically to keep cold air out. She said nothing to Warren that night, mostly because she was not yet certain how serious the problem actually was, and partly because admitting a flaw before fully understanding it felt premature, even to herself. The following morning, walking the barn's interior in daylight, she noticed something she had not expected. A faint line of frost had formed along the inside of the steel near that same eastern corner, delicate and almost decorative, tracing precisely the path the cold air had taken as it entered overnight. Elias found her studying the frost pattern and asked what it meant. Agnes did not have a complete answer yet, only a growing suspicion that the barn itself, through nothing more mysterious than ice and cold metal, was quietly showing her something the wind refused to say in words. She traced the frost line with one gloved finger, following it back toward its source, aware that whatever she had built was not yet finished, no matter how confident she had felt standing in front of it 11 days earlier. For 3 consecutive mornings, Agnes returned to the same corner before feeding the herd, studying the frost pattern before the barn's rising daytime temperature could melt away the evidence. Each morning, the frost traced a nearly identical path, a narrow silver line running from the gap near the eave downward along the interior steel, spreading slightly wider as it descended, like water finding the lowest available course. She realized, standing there on the 3rd morning with her breath fogging in the cold air, that the frost was not simply decoration left behind by an accidental draft. It was a map. It showed her exactly where the cold air entered, and exactly which direction it traveled once inside the trapped pocket she had built, and precisely how far it managed to spread before finally losing enough of its force to stop moving. The gap itself was small, barely noticeable to the eye, hidden where the curve of the salvaged steel met the older, slightly uneven wood of the barn's original eave. Wood settles unevenly over years, warping in ways steel never does, and Agnes had not accounted for the small but persistent gap that mismatch created. She mentioned the discovery to Warren that afternoon, expecting some satisfaction from him at having been right to doubt the design initially. Instead, he simply nodded slowly and said that finding the leak this early, before the real storm arrived, was worth more than if the structure had somehow been perfect from the very first night. He was not wrong, though it took Agnes a moment to fully appreciate what he meant. A structure that revealed its weakness during a mild, cold snap was a structure still capable of being fixed. A structure that hid its weakness until the worst storm in decades arrived would not offer anyone a second chance to learn from it. She spent that evening at the kitchen table again, not with the ledger this time, but with a scrap of paper on which she sketched the eave's uneven profile as best she remembered it, trying to picture exactly what material might follow the wood's irregular surface closely enough to finally stop the draft the frost had so patiently mapped out for her. Elias, watching from across the table, asked whether more steel would fix it. Agnes shook her head slowly. Steel was rigid. It followed straight lines beautifully and irregular ones poorly. Whatever sealed that gap needed to be something that could bend, compress, and settle into an uneven space the way steel simply could not. She already suspected what that answer might be. She had, after all, watched it work by accident for 2 winters already, stacked carelessly along a different wall entirely, never once considered a deliberate solution until this moment. The solution, once Agnes allowed herself to see it clearly, had been sitting in her own hayloft the entire time. Compressed hay bales, packed tightly enough, could bend around an uneven surface in ways rigid steel or wood never would. She had watched it happen by accident during her 2nd winter, when bales stacked hastily against a drafty section of the original barn wall had settled over time into every gap and irregularity, quietly stopping a draft she had never deliberately tried to fix. She selected her densest bales, the ones compressed tightly enough to hold their shape without collapsing, and worked with Elias on a cold but calm afternoon to wedge them carefully along the eave gap, compressing each one firmly enough that it filled the irregular space between curved steel and settled wood almost completely. Using her husband's brass ruler, she measured the remaining thin gaps after each bale was placed, adjusting position by fractions of an inch until the frost pattern she had studied for days had essentially nowhere left to travel. Warren watched the process with open skepticism, asking directly whether packed hay could really stop a determined winter wind the way steel and careful carpentry had failed to. Agnes reminded him gently that hay was not stopping the wind through strength. It was stopping it through shape, filling every small, irregular space that rigid materials left open by necessity. He was not fully convinced, but he helped anyway, packing the final and most awkward section near the corner where the eaves warp was most severe, grumbling that he still preferred a solution he could nail down properly. That evening, Agnes checked the corner one final time before dark, running her bare hand along the seam where cold air had entered for 3 consecutive nights. She felt nothing. No draft, no thin whisper of moving air, only still and steady cold, exactly as it should have been. She did not celebrate. She had learned, over 3 difficult winters, that a single quiet evening proved very little on its own. What she had built might hold against a passing cold snap, and still fail completely against something larger, something that tested every seam and gap simultaneously instead of politely revealing them one at a time, the way this smaller problem had. The real test, she knew, was still weeks away, gathering itself somewhere out over the plains the old men at the feed store had already given a number to. The first real test arrived in mid-November, a 2-day storm that dropped heavy snow and dangerously cold temperatures across the region, though nothing yet approaching what the feed store's older residents continued to predict for later in the season. Agnes moved the herd fully into the barn's new interior shelter the evening before the storm reached them, watching the cattle settle along the curved steel walls with what she chose to interpret as calm rather than mere exhaustion. Elias stayed close to the house that night, his cough worsening slightly with the sudden temperature drop, though not seriously enough yet to frighten her the way it sometimes could. By the second morning, as the storm began finally weakening, Agnes walked the barn's interior and found something genuinely encouraging. The steel walls felt noticeably less cold than the exposed sections of the original barn, and more importantly, none of her calves showed the shivering, huddled posture she remembered painfully from the 2 previous winters. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself something close to relief. That relief lasted until she noticed a second, smaller frost pattern forming along a different section of the barn entirely. On the western wall this time, rather than the northern and eastern sections, she had reinforced most carefully. The storm's wind, she realized upon closer study, had not come from the direction she and Warren had assumed would dominate the season. It had shifted partway through the 2 days, pulling more heavily from the west than either of them had planned for when positioning the original steel panels. Warren, inspecting the same frost pattern beside her, admitted quietly that he had never seen a storm front behave quite that way before, shifting so significantly partway through its own passage rather than holding one steady direction throughout. Agnes understood immediately what this meant. Her solution had worked, partially, against the storm she had prepared for. It had not yet been tested against a storm that refused to behave the way previous winters had trained her to expect. The worst storm in 34 years, according to everything she had heard repeated at the feed store for weeks, was still coming, and she now understood, with unsettling clarity, that it might not arrive from the direction she had spent 11 days building against. The storm announced itself 3 days before it arrived, in the form of a telegram from the county weather station that Warren rode out specifically to deliver. his expression graver than Agnes had seen it in the 3 years they had worked together. She spent those 3 days reinforcing the western wall as best the remaining time allowed, using additional compressed hay wherever the steel met original wood, though she knew, honestly, that a rushed reinforcement built in 3 days could never match the careful, measured work of the original 11. The storm arrived at night, exactly as predicted, with wind strong enough to genuinely frighten the cattle despite the shelter around them, and snow falling so heavily that Agnes lost sight of the house from the barn doorway within the storm's first hour. By midnight, Elias's cough had worsened noticeably, tightening into something that made Agnes's chest ache with a fear entirely separate from the storm itself. She moved him from the house into the barn's warmest corner, wrapped in every blanket she owned, close enough to the reinforced steel wall that he could feel, even through his discomfort, that the metal there was genuinely different from the bitter cold radiating off the barn's exposed sections elsewhere. Sometime past 2 in the morning, exactly as Agnes had feared 3 days earlier, the wind shifted again, swinging harder from the west than even her hurried reinforcements had fully anticipated. She heard it before she felt it, a low change in the sound outside the walls, and moments later noticed the temperature near Elias's corner dropping in a way that made her stomach tighten with dread. She had a choice to make, standing there in lantern light with her son coughing softly beside her, and Warren shouting something from further down the barn about the herd growing restless near the western wall. She could attempt an emergency seal in the middle of the storm itself, risking exposure to wind and cold that could genuinely endanger her, or she could trust the reinforcement she had already built, imperfect as it was, and focus instead on keeping Elias as warm and calm as possible until morning. She chose to trust the wall, packing what additional loose hay she could reach directly around her son rather than venturing into the worst of the exposed western section, reasoning that a partial defense already standing was safer to rely upon than an improvised one built blindly in darkness and dangerous wind. The storm did not weaken until almost dawn, and Agnes spent every remaining hour of that night simply listening to the wind, to her son's breathing, to the cattle shifting uneasily along walls she could only hope were holding exactly as she had intended. Morning arrived pale and strangely silent, the way it often does after a storm has finally exhausted itself completely. Agnes stepped outside first, wading through snow deeper than anything she remembered from previous winters, and stood for a long moment simply staring at a landscape that had been reshaped overnight into something almost unrecognizable. Inside the barn, the news was better than she had allowed herself to hope for during the worst hours of the night. Every calf had survived. The herd stood restless but alive along the reinforced walls, steam rising gently from their breath into air that remained noticeably milder near the steel than it did near the barn's older, unmodified sections. Elias's cough, though still present, had not worsened further overnight, and color had returned to his face by the time the sun cleared the horizon completely. Warren found Agnes standing near the western corner, where the wind had shifted so dangerously hours earlier. The hasty reinforcement she had packed there in only 3 days had held, barely, showing clear signs of strain, but no actual failure. He said nothing for a long moment, simply looking at the frost-free steel, then finally admitted that he had genuinely expected to find at least some part of the structure had given way overnight. It nearly did, Agnes told him honestly, but nearly was not the same as did, and this particular morning, that difference was the only one that mattered. 2 days later, Ezra Caldwell rode over, dismounting at her fence line with none of the confident amusement he had carried during his visit back in October. He did not mention the coffee he had wagered, and he did not bring up the joke about her surplus steel huts. He simply stood looking at her barn for a long moment, then asked, plainly and without pride, whether she might be willing to walk him through exactly what she had built inside those walls. Agnes said she would, and meant it, remembering clearly the choice she had quietly made months earlier about whether a solution like this deserved to remain hers alone or deserved to spread further than her own fence line. Word of the barn traveled through the county slowly over the following months, the way useful things often do among people who have learned not to trust ideas until they have watched them survive something real. The Quonset hut itself was never beautiful, never meant to be admired the way a well-built porch or a handsome fence might be. It remained quietly exactly what it always was, not a solution to the cold itself, but an answer to the particular ways that cold had once found its way into a place meant to keep it out. The barn had never needed to defeat the wind entirely. It only needed to give the wind fewer paths inside, and give one widow and her son enough warmth to see the worst storm in 34 years turn, eventually, into nothing more than a story people told afterward at the feed store, standing near the same stove where the warning had first begun. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.